Hello and welcome back to the Altius Images Drone Positive Podcast. I'm Todd Dudley and I'm the founder and director of Altius Images. This is a bonus episode of the pod this week. I was fortunate enough to go down to London last week to the Drone Tech Conference at the Oval Space, and this podcast is just a bit of a review and a summary with some of my takeaways from that conference. So a little bit more in depth and detail than the previous pod. If you're expecting to hear just another positive drone story, then come back tomorrow to hear that episode. But for today, let's fly into the conference and see what we thought. So there were various panels throughout the day. So the first panel was a panel on delivery drones and where the future of that technology is going. So Duncan Walker, the MD of Skyports, and Andy Sage, the head of drones at NATS, were on this panel. It was a general discussion about using drones for delivery, where the technology is and where it's going in the future. Very interesting panel, some really insightful stuff. So let's get into what they were talking about. So obviously, using drones for delivery is something that's in the public eye already, with Amazon announcing their plans to do this all the way back in 2013. They started off the panel by highlighting just how easy it was to use drones for delivery. In terms of the technical aspects, it is easy. The technology exists. We can automate flights. We can have drones with relatively decent sized payloads that would make sense to use for delivery. The issue is making sure that it is safe and making sure that it makes commercial sense, and also making sure that the public are on board with it. Because as we know, at the moment, that's probably not the case. If you've seen the latest Confused.com advert, then shock horror, they're painting drones in a negative light by having a swarm of delivery drones almost attack a man in a car. So technically we're there. It's just getting the public on side and making sure it makes sense commercially as well. They spoke about lots of live trials that are happening in other places of the world, places like Switzerland and Sweden. And they also said that at the moment, the focus of these trials is more on medical delivery than e-commerce delivery. The reason for this, they said, is just that it's easier to get this past the public. Easier to convince people that delivering blood's a good idea rather than delivering a pair of trainers. So there will be practical and commercial trials of delivery drones by 2020, but on a pretty small scale. So they spoke a little bit about what might hold us back in the UK specifically. They said that one of the reasons the UK might not adopt this as quickly as other places is the airspace in the UK is extremely well regulated. This partly comes down to our culture as a country and a nation, that we are very aware of safety, but also just the fact we've got one of the busiest airspaces in the world and actually not that big a country. So it's difficult to have lots of live tests and practical tests when the airspace is so busy. Duncan did give an example of a trial he did in Helsinki, which was less than 500 metres from the airport. He applied for permission to do this flight and received that permission in less than 48 hours. Probably something that wouldn't happen in the UK, rightly or wrongly, but it is definitely something that's probably slowing us down. So they asked if we're falling behind of the rest of the world in this area. Duncan also made a good point and went on to say that within this sector, nothing really comes from the UK. So whether it's the tech, the hardware, the software, none of that's really developed in the UK. Again, this could be something to do with our airspace, that our airspace doesn't really lend itself to these kinds of trials. But he also questioned whether our universities have sort of the wrong educational background for this. Is there enough of an emphasis on STEM? I know that's improving, but again, compared to other countries in the world, we're a fairly long way behind. So Duncan went on to speak about the safety of his drones. And interestingly, he said his drones have lots of physical redundancies, whether that's parachutes that self-deploy or 6 rotors in case one fails so it can still fly. It's got those redundancies, but the difficulty is communicating with the drone when it goes around a building or over a hill. How this communication happens between the remote and the drone is not sort of consistent and streamlined around the world. So depending on where you are, it can make it extremely difficult to get this consistent and reliable. He gave an example about Africa where their signal wasn't very strong, so they just turned up the frequency. So this obviously meant that the control on the drone didn't match the frequency that the towers were putting out, so therefore the drones didn't fly. And they very briefly mentioned how low-orbit satellites could help this. This was discussed a little bit more in a panel later on, so I'll get onto that a bit more later on. Duncan also spoke about some of the other challenges that he's faced so far in developing this tech. He spoke about the payload and that should be a relatively simple piece of technology, but particularly when thinking about medical delivery, ensuring that the payload can regulate its own temperature proved relatively complicated. Another issue that they faced is the remote comms link, as briefly mentioned earlier. They had to build this system completely from scratch. They've made good progress with that, and last week, in fact, they had a drone flying in Russia that they were controlling from Wakefield. So that's pretty exciting stuff and shows that the technology is coming on quite a lot. And then interestingly, the parachute has proved quite difficult. Because the drones fly so quickly, but are still relatively lightweight, it's been difficult to engineer the parachute so that it doesn't just tear the drone apart when it's deployed, which I found really, really interesting and something I hadn't thought about. Now, a lot of this panel was talking about sort of safety and regulation and trying to get on side with the regulators. They made one great point. The operators in this space, so that are working with delivery drones, they want the safest use possible. The reason for this is that if something were to go wrong, then the industry would get put back 10, 15 years. They said sophisticated companies within this sector are working with regulators to try and move things on as quickly and as safely as possible. And Andy had a great quote, which was, "Safety is the enabler, not the obstacle." They then mentioned another obstacle that this injury's got to climb over, and that was, as we mentioned briefly earlier, public trust and sort of perception of using drones for delivery. The question was raised, has this got better? And they agreed that it ebbs and flows a little bit, and events like Gatwick around Christmas, they obviously don't help. But they felt that the media need to share more positive stories. Fortunately, that's exactly what this podcast is doing, so please do subscribe and share if you feel the same way, if you feel we need to get more positivity out there. And Duncan finished by saying that it, as well as spreading positivity, it's also a bit of a marketing ploy from these companies. So Amazon, I think just last week or a couple of weeks ago, they've said that whilst their drones deliver, they will also provide security to the public. So Duncan made the point by just saying security there rather than surveillance, it completely changes the narrative and puts a positive spin on it. And that's sort of what we need to do a bit more of, really. So this was a brilliant panel with some very exciting stuff to look forward to, and it was a great start to the day. Next up was a talk from a chap called Ian Kiley, who was the CEO of Drone Consultants Ireland, and he was talking about developments that are being worked on at the moment throughout the industry. This was probably, for me, the most interesting and exciting talk of the day, so let's dive into what he had to talk about. So he started off by talking about a company called Car Trawler, which is an Irish company which turned over 1.5 billion last year, so they're doing okay. They've just started a company called Manna, M-A-N-N-A. Now, this company will deliver food by drone, so sort of like a Deliveroo of the skies. And amazingly, this is being implemented by December this year. They have an entire town in Ireland committed to the system. So we're not talking about 2020 or in 5 years' time or over the next 2 or 3 years. This is a system that's been developed and it's being implemented by December this year, which is very, very exciting. So these drones, which are aircraft quality with triple redundancies, will stop 30 metres over the house and lower the food down by a winch. So you don't have that safety concern of the public having to get close to the drone while it's landing and taking off, because the food, the payload, is just being lowered down via winch, which is a great idea. Ian then went on to speak about GPS and the inefficiency and inaccuracy of this system. I'm sure we've all had it where we're using a sat-nav or maps on our phones and it thinks we're somewhere where we're not. It's just a few metres out, or maybe it thinks we're facing the wrong way. The same thing can happen with drones if they don't have a good enough satellite signal, which can happen. This can obviously be a bit more dangerous with drones than it is with us just holding our phones trying to walk down the street. So the solution to this, as Ian argued anyway, is low orbit satellites. These were obviously mentioned earlier, so we'll go into a bit more detail now. So these orbit just outside the Earth's atmosphere and are far more efficient. They have a 0.2 second latency and can pinpoint location with much more accuracy. SpaceX, which is obviously one of Elon Musk's company, they're launching 200 of these this year alone. They're much cheaper to launch than normal satellites, partly because they're very small, so you can launch several at a time. And the great thing about them is when they've reached the end of their lifespan, which is about 3 years, rather than staying in orbit and becoming space junk, because they're so much lower, they fall into Earth's atmosphere and burn up, which leaves no space junk at all. So the Horizon 2020 project, which is being launched by Thales, Drone Consultants Ireland and Consortium, will endeavour to put chips into phones and drones that can use these satellites to give location data within 2 centimetres. Now obviously just for the everyday consumer this is great news, because it will make their positioning on their phones and when they're using sat-nav, that kind of thing, much more reliable. But for drones especially, this could be a huge breakthrough. Now, the last thing that Ian spoke about, he didn't go into huge amounts of detail with, because he was running out of time slightly. So if I get any of this wrong, I do apologise to Ian and anyone else that knows more than me. But I'll give it my best go to describe it. So he was talking about some tech that's being developed that will assist with forest fires, flash floods, that kind of thing. And essentially how it will work is that a plane will fly over the troubled area, drones will parachute out of the back of the plane, They'll land with pinpoint location using these low orbit satellites. And what's really interesting is that they'll have a payload, which is actually a generator and a battery for the drone. So they land all together with the payload. The drone then takes back off, leaving the payload on the floor, but it remains attached to that payload, that generator, with a cable that powers the drone. So this means that the drone can fly for as long as the rotors last rather than as long as the batteries last. It'd be much easier to describe this with a picture, so hopefully you sort of know what I mean. Essentially, imagine a drone flying in the air, a cable going down to the ground where there's a generator. The drone then has an optical camera on it which can see up to 10 kilometers away and send data back where it needs to be. This could obviously be an incredibly important advancement in terms of search and rescue. To have a drone that can last for however long the rotors last, that can also see 10 kilometers away, that is also right in the area where the fire is, where the flood is, whatever it might be, could save hundreds if not thousands of lives. As I said at the start, this was the talk that excited and inspired me the most, and it showed just how much progress is being made right now rather than in 3 years, in 5 years, in 10 years. It shows just how much progress is being made now, which I thought was really exciting. Next, we had the European Aviation Safety Agency regulations explained, which essentially outline the changes to the regulations that will happen over the next couple of years. These changes will take place from the 1st of July 2020. There'll be a transitional period from this point until the 1st of July 2022, when the full changes will come into effect. Pretty number and spec heavy, this one, so I won't go over that here, but you can find the details on the EASA website if you are interested. The next panel was titled The Future of Drones in the UK, and on this panel we had Elaine White, who's the PwC Technology and Innovation Director, Paul Rigby, who is the CEO and co-founder of Consortic, and Jamie Allen, who is the CEO of Allen Panthera. This was a more business-centric talk, but still gave some interesting insight. They started off by saying that we are in a good place, we're seeing plenty of growth in the industry at the moment, and that engineering and construction is a well-saturated market now. Plenty of companies are using drones and even starting to bring it in-house now, so training their own employees rather than getting third-party companies in. A big emphasis of this talk was about the need to try and make it easier for pilots to fly beyond visual line of sight, as this is obviously a fairly restrictive rule. The new regulations that were mentioned briefly earlier from the European Aviation Safety Agency, these new regulations could make flying beyond visual line of sight a little bit easier. Again, if you want the details of how that might work, check out the EASA website for those details. Obviously, the title is The Future of Drones in the UK, so they spoke about some potential uses that they see for drones, and this is mainly in sort of big industry, not so much cinema and film, but big industry and that kind of thing. So one use that they spoke about was that drones could be stored offshore on an unmanned platform where they can autonomously or remotely take off, conduct a survey of a wind farm or whatever it might be, and then return to the platform. And actually something similar is already happening, where an autonomous surface vessel, they called it, which is just a boat, carries an autonomous drone out to an offshore wind farm and then brings it back once the drone has finished the survey. So again, what could be an interesting space to keep an eye on is the integration between autonomous fleets. Another potential use that Elaine mentioned, because she'd had some transport trouble in the last week or two, was to do with train line inspections. So currently, Network Rail use 13 trains and manned helicopters to inspect their lines to see if there's damage, obstructions, etc., etc. Elaine pondered whether a swarm of drones could be launched from these trains to inspect the lines, and she argued that they would collect the data far more efficiently and cost effectively. And then Paul finished the talk with an interesting question. He wondered if the training process for drones needed changing or adjusting slightly. He argued that manned aviation training is very prescriptive. If you do this, then you can do this. If you then do this, then you can then do this. Should UAV training, he asked, be more prescriptive so that it's easier to achieve more? So, for example, rather than having to send off X amount of forms, X amount of time before you want to do a job where you need to fly beyond visual line of sight, he wondered if there is just not a little bit of training that you could do, which would then allow you to fly beyond visual line of sight whenever you needed to do it. Really interesting question. And as we know, this industry is extremely young and immature. So there is no doubt that the training structure will change over the years. And Paul's wondering whether it should come more in line with how manned aviation training works. The next talk definitely had the most interesting title of the day, that's for sure. This one was called Surface, Underwater, Air and Space, the Breadth of the Drone Industry. This was a talk given by Tim Spink, who is the Operations Director at Drone Major Group. Now, anything with the word space in is going to grab my attention pretty easily, but this one was extremely interesting and some very cool stuff shown throughout the talk. So we started by making the point that we shouldn't be too narrow-minded with what we think of as drones. I'm definitely guilty of this as well, but I'm sure if you asked any member of the public what they thought a drone was, I'm sure they would describe a drone that flies in the air. However, the definition he gave for drones, which is absolutely right, is any unmanned system which is remotely or autonomously controlled. It doesn't have to be in the air. So basically he went through the current and future uses for each type of drone, so I'll just do the same now, running through relatively quickly. So he started off talking about surface ground drones, which are, as the name suggests, drones that operate on the surface. And some future developments that he gave for this are passenger carrying, so sort of drone taxis, that kind of thing. There's obviously always a lot of talk about self-driving cars and what Tesla are doing in this space, and this is one that's probably not all that far away. He then spoke about freight delivery. He mentioned pollinators for agriculture to replace what bees are doing. We're down a third of the population of bees in the world now, unfortunately, but surface ground drones can be used to replace what the bees are doing for the plants, at least. There are then obviously remote humanoid systems, which is a posh term for a robot, I guess. Again, we've seen some pretty hefty developments in this industry recently with the Boston Dynamics videos that are coming out and that kind of thing. He then moved on to surface marine drones, which are, again, autonomous systems that operate between the surface and the sea or water. He outlined the current applications for this. So again, going through fairly quickly, mine and submarine detection or protection, border protection, mining, drilling, data gathering, prospecting, environmental prospecting, so looking at oil spill and trying to mitigate that, hazardous material detection, ocean environment and habitat monitoring. So plenty of stuff being done with autonomous systems already in that space. Some future uses that he mentioned were things such as inner city freight delivery via river, autonomous cargo ships and ferries, ocean-wide communication networks, and advanced border security. He then moved on to underwater drones and again gave us some current uses. Exploration and surveying, mine clearance, hull cleaning and repair, advanced dredging, deep sea research, pipeline inspection, reef regeneration, pest control, environmental monitoring with things like the Echo Voyager from Boeing. There's a Ranger bot that operates in the Great Barrier Reef that targets and destroys coral eating starfish, which is very interesting. Depends whether you're on the starfish's side or the coral side, whether you approve of that. And then some future uses he spoke about, humanoid engineers. So again, essentially sending down robots to do work under the water. I can't help but think of the Iron Man scene where he does some welding underwater for that bit. And then, of course, transport, whether it's for people or for cargo. Moving on to what we are more familiar with when we're talking about drones that operate in the air. Current uses, again, we know a lot of these: inspection, security, surveillance, mapping, crop management, 3D mapping of land, prospecting, environmental monitoring, emergency response, pest control, all of that kind of jazz. I'm sure a lot of you are either doing or are familiar with some of those uses. And then some future uses for this. He mentioned high-rise building fire response, which is an interesting one. Again, pollination, so rather from the ground, from the sky this time. Advanced policing and security, passenger and freight. And then he mentioned two drones that are currently under development. One that can carry a payload of a ton, which is pretty impressive, and one that can allegedly travel at 700 miles an hour. Not sure how long the batteries would last on that one, but some seriously exciting stuff. And then the best bit, he went into talking about space. So current uses of drones, autonomous systems, in space are satellites, which are used for surveillance, communication, drones being used for space station monitoring, scientific research, that kind of thing, and some future uses which absolutely fascinate me. First one he spoke about was satellite servicing. So sending a drone to a satellite to repair any damage that it's got. This will apparently prolong the life of satellites by about 5 years, and then it will put them into graveyard orbit when completely dead. This will, as we mentioned earlier, limit the amount of space junk that we're just leaving up there. Another use, they are sending a drone to Mars, I think next year, and this is going to help the Mars rover. It's essentially going to fly above the Mars rover and guide exploration for it to make sure it doesn't get into any trouble. And then finally, my favourite potential future use for space drones, mainly because it reminds me of the film Armageddon, is asteroid drilling and mining. So the idea is that they can send drones to asteroids to drill and mine for resources, which can then be used either here on Earth, by satellites, by rockets. So the example that Tim gave, he said that rockets use about 90% of their energy and resources when taking off. So if they can dock on an asteroid, which has been mined for resources in advance by a drone, this could assist with deeper and further space travel. So some very exciting potential uses there. And then he left us with just a little bit of a tease and spoke briefly about hybrid drone technology. So, for example, an aerial pod or cabin or taxi that can transport people or things that can then be dropped onto autonomous chassis or wheels to continue that transport. This is a great concept. How far we are away from this, I'm not really sure, but an exciting thing to think about. So after this talk from Tim, we then had a short talk from a chap called Stephen Timewell, who's the head of the Association of Responsible Drone Users. He was essentially saying that we need to see an end to the scaremongering and negativity presented in the media towards drones. Again, that's exactly the aim of this podcast. We're trying to present the other side of the story, sharing as much positivity as possible. So please do share the podcast and spread the positivity. Then in the penultimate presentation of the day, we had Kathy Nothstein, who's the head of future cities at Nesta, and she was outlining a programme that's trying to position the UK as a global leader in shaping urban drone systems that place people's needs first. So this programme was launched in 2017 as a 3-phase project. Phase 1 was to engage with 5 cities across the UK and research use cases. That phase has been completed and went very successfully. Phase 2, which they've just reached the end of, was to design capabilities and challenge prize specifications. And phase 3, which is just launching at the moment, this is essentially the competition phase, and they are looking for companies who are working on systems that could provide urban drone services, such as medical delivery or search and rescue services. So if this sounds like something you or your company would be interested in, I'll put a link in the description below for more detail on that. And then to finish the day, we had a great talk from Gemma Alcock, who's the CEO of Skybound Rescuer. She was presenting some results of a paper that is being published in September. So it was nice to hear about these results before the paper actually goes out. So I won't go into loads of detail on this because obviously it's not my paper. If you do want to see the full paper when it comes out, follow Skybound Rescuer on social media, and I'm sure you'll see it on there when September comes. So the focus of this study was to see how drones can save lives that couldn't be saved before. So Skybound Rescuer and Gemma partnered with Essex Police, who have used drones since 2014, and they currently have 65 drone pilots, which is pretty good going. The solution to the focus was to provide a deployment pack, which is essentially a training pack for pilots and drone teams, and the DJI Inspire 1 flight reference cards. The point of these were to try to simplify and optimize complex decision-making, drone procedures, and incident recording. The hope was that this would improve the consistency and effectiveness of utilizing drones in search and rescue scenarios. And fortunately, it did. So just some key findings. Again, if you want the full report, follow Skybound Rescue on social media and you'll see it there in September. But some key findings, they had a 90 to 91% procedural accuracy as opposed to 60% without the deployment pack and FRCs. It improved the completion of safety critical procedures by 30 to 36%. It improved the completion of procedures critical for mission success by 10 to 15%. It improved the completion of procedures critical for equipment longevity by 16 to 23%. So as you can see from those few key findings, it was an extremely positive trial, and it is no doubt a huge step towards Skybound Rescue's end goal, which is to standardise performance to a reliably high level across the spectrum of pilot competency. So basically trying to improve the reliability of using drones, whether it's a pilot with 30 hours experience or 3,000 hours experience. As I said, full paper comes out in September, so if you are interested, keep your eye out for that on Skybound Rescue's social media. And that talk from Gemma brought us to the end of the day. It was an extremely interesting and insightful day. I'm really glad I went down, heard some great people talk, met some great people, and it was well worth the price of admission. So as I said at the top of the pod, quite an in-depth, detailed one for this episode. Hopefully you've enjoyed it, found it useful. If you weren't at the conference, hopefully this has given you at least a decent summary of the day. But as I said, a really interesting and insightful day. This was a bonus episode of the podcast. So this is going to replace the usual drone positive episode. Episode 2 of that will be coming out tomorrow. But for now, follow us on social media at Altius Images. Please share the podcast. Let's spread this positivity as far and wide as possible. Thank you for listening, and I will see you tomorrow for episode 2 of the Drone Positive podcast. Fly safe, folks. Bye-bye.